My brothers and sisters, open your eyes and look at what is unfolding in our world today. For too long, we've seen people silenced, youth ignored, and generations told to sit down and be quiet. But when truth is pressed down, when justice is delayed, when voices are ignored, there will come a shaking, and right now, Nepal is experiencing such a shaking. Not merely political, not merely cultural, but generational. When a nation suppresses the cries of its people, when truth is hidden under layers of corruption and injustice, when generations are told to be silent, there comes a time when the silence itself becomes too heavy to carry. Nepal today is experiencing that weight, and the pressure has become unbearable. The shaking you see in the streets, the voices you hear rising up, are not sudden explosions of anger. They are the result of years of frustration, disappointment, and promises never fulfilled. A nation can only bottle up the hunger for change for so long before it erupts into a movement. This shaking is not merely political, it is spiritual. You cannot understand what is happening on the surface unless you recognize what is stirring underneath. People have been longing for dignity, for fairness, for leadership that does not abuse its power, and for systems that do not keep them trapped in cycles of despair. Whenever those longings are ignored, the foundations of society begin to tremble. Nepal is showing us that when the cry of a people is strong enough, no government, no law, no tradition can hold it back. The unrest is evidence of a deeper groaning within the nation's soul. What makes this shaking so powerful is that it is generational. This is not simply one political party versus another. This is not the elite against the poor. This is not just city against countryside. This is a generation saying, we will not inherit broken systems without raising our voice. The youth of Nepal have come to a point where silence is no longer an option. They see the gap between what is promised and what is delivered, and they refuse to sit quietly in that gap any longer. When young people decide they've had enough, the shaking begins to spread like wildfire because their voices carry the future. And notice this, whenever you see a shaking in history, it is always preceded by silence. Silence is deceptive. On the surface, it looks like peace. On the surface, it looks like compliance. On the surface, it looks like nothing is happening. But silence is often the soil where unrest is growing, and the moment silence breaks, it comes forth like a flood. In Nepal, what seemed quiet for too long was not peace. It was suppression. And now, that suppression has given birth to expression. The voices are loud, the demands are strong, and the silence has been shattered. The shaking also reveals something about power. Power is never truly secure when it is built on fear, intimidation, or control. True power is sustained by trust, and when trust is broken, power becomes fragile. Nepal's leaders are seeing that fragility exposed. The revolt is not simply against individuals, it is against the systems and structures that have failed to honor the people's trust. And once the people recognize that power, without accountability is illegitimate. They begin to challenge it in ways that cannot be stopped. That's why this shaking feels unstoppable. Because it's not directed at one man, but at an entire way of governing that has lost its credibility. But the shaking also has another dimension. It is a revelation of identity. When people rise up, they are not just rejecting corruption. They are reclaiming their dignity. They are saying, we are more than pawns in a political game. We are more than tools to be used. We are a generation with a voice, and we will no longer be silent. This is not only a battle for justice, it is a battle for recognition. It is a declaration that the worth of the people is not determined by those in power, but by the inherent dignity of every human being created with purpose. At the same time, the shaking is disruptive. No shaking is comfortable. No shaking leaves everything neatly in place. When the ground trembles, what is weak will fall, what is unstable will collapse, and what is false will be exposed. That is what is happening in Nepal. The weak promises are collapsing. The unstable foundations are being tested, and the lies that have been told are being uncovered. The shaking is painful, but it is necessary because sometimes the old structures must fall apart in order for something new to rise. And let us not overlook the fact that the shaking is contagious. What begins in one city spreads to another. What begins in one generation inspires another. When one group of young people finds its voice, it emboldens others to lift theirs. Nepal's revolt is not happening in isolation. Around the world, other young people are watching, learning, and realizing that they too can resist systems that do not serve them. The shaking in Nepal is echoing beyond its borders because truth and courage always inspire imitation. This shaking also demands interpretation. If you only look at it through the lens of politics, you will miss its depth. If you only analyze it with economics, you will miss its heartbeat. If you only reduce it to protests and policies, you will not see the hand of destiny at work. The shaking is not just about what is happening in government offices. It is about what is happening in the hearts of a generation. A nation's destiny is never written solely by its leaders. It is also written by the courage of its people. That courage is now being written in the streets of Nepal. And so the shaking continues. It rattles the comfort of the powerful. It disrupts the routines of the status quo. It unsettles the false peace of silence. And it reminds us all that when people are denied long enough, they will rise. When truth is suppressed long enough, it will break through. When dignity is ignored long enough, it will demand attention. What is happening in Nepal is the sound of that demand, echoing through a nation. And it is only the beginning of what such a shaking can reveal. There is nothing more powerful than a generation that suddenly realizes its voice matters. For years, young people in Nepal were expected to stay in the background, to accept the systems as they were, to quietly inherit the realities handed down by those before them. But every generation has a breaking point. Every generation reaches a moment when it refuses to remain silent. And when that moment comes, the world has to pay attention, because the voice of the youth has always been the voice of change. This awakening is not about numbers alone. It is about clarity. When young people discover that they have been given both a voice and the courage to use it, they are no longer content to sit on the sidelines. They see the corruption, the inefficiency, the broken promises, and they refuse to let those patterns define their future. A generation awakened becomes like a storm. It sweeps through with force, with energy, with passion that cannot be tamed. That is what Nepal is seeing right now, a generation that will not be silenced by intimidation or delayed by empty words. And the power of this awakening is rooted in its honesty. The youth are not pretending that everything is fine. They are not masking their frustration behind polite smiles. They are naming the failures out loud. They are pointing to the injustices without hesitation, and they are saying, "We deserve better." When truth is spoken with that kind of rawness, it cannot easily be dismissed. Leaders may try to ignore it, but the honesty of youth always exposes what has been hidden. What makes this even more powerful is that the awakened generation is not waiting for permission. They are not waiting for older systems to validate them. They are not waiting for institutions to grant them space. They are creating their own platforms, raising their own banners, and building their own movements. When a generation realizes it does not need permission to speak, its voice becomes unstoppable. Nepal's youth are stepping out of the shadows and declaring that their future will be shaped by their own hands, not dictated by the neglect of others. There is also a boldness that comes with awakening. Fear loses its grip when passion takes hold. Once young people realize that the risk of silence is greater than the risk of speaking out, they no longer hesitate. That is why revolutions so often begin with the young. They are not weighed down by decades of compromise. They are not trapped by layers of fear. And they are not willing to trade their future for temporary comfort. Their boldness becomes a fire that spreads from one voice to another until the silence of yesterday is drowned out by the cries of today. But this awakening is not only about protest, it is about vision. The young in Nepal are not just saying what they do not want, they are also imagining what they do want. That is the unique strength of an awakened generation. They do not simply tear down, they dream of what can be built. They imagine a nation where dignity is preserved, where justice is not delayed, where opportunities are available, and where their talents are not wasted. This kind of vision is dangerous to broken systems because it offers hope that the status quo cannot provide. And once that vision takes root, it begins to shape identity. A generation that has been awakened no longer sees itself as powerless or voiceless. They begin to walk with confidence, to speak with authority, to act with determination. They start to see themselves not as victims of their circumstances, but as participants in writing history. This change in mindset is what makes the awakening so unstoppable. Because once people know their worth, they can never go back to believing they are worthless. The awakening of Nepal's youth is also deeply connected to technology and communication. Unlike previous generations, these young men and women have access to information, to platforms, to networks that allow their voices to travel far beyond their own neighborhoods. They are not limited to whispers in the dark. They can shout across the globe with a single post. This amplifies their strength and spreads their message with speed that older systems cannot contain. An awakened generation with modern tools becomes a movement that crosses borders and cannot easily be silenced. What makes this moment particularly significant is the unity that awakening produces. Differences that once divided become less important when a generation finds its common purpose. Rural and urban, rich and poor, educated and uneducated. When the young realize they are all facing the same future, they rally together in ways that older generations often failed to do. Nepal's youth are discovering that their strength is not just in their numbers, but in their ability to come together with one voice. That unity is what gives the revolt its sharp edge and its undeniable presence. And as this awakening continues to unfold, it grows in momentum. The more young people speak, the more others are emboldened to join them. The more courage is displayed, the more fear loses its grip. The more vision is shared, the more hope spreads like wildfire. Awakening is not a one-time event. It is a process, a wave that grows larger and stronger until it cannot be stopped. And in Nepal, that wave is rising higher and higher, carrying with it the power of a generation that has finally realized its moment has come. Every uprising carries with it a choice. Will it remain an expression of resistance, or will it mature into a movement of revival? Resistance is fueled by anger, pain, and disappointment. It erupts when people can no longer bear the weight of silence or injustice. But revival is fueled by vision, direction, and hope. Resistance can tear down what is broken, but revival builds something better in its place. Nepal's young generation now finds itself standing at that critical intersection where passion must be transformed into purpose. Resistance in itself is not a negative thing. Without resistance, oppressive systems remain unchallenged. Without resistance, corruption continues unchecked. Without resistance, the cries of the people are ignored. But resistance is incomplete when it stops at anger. Anger can bring people into the streets, but it cannot alone write laws, build institutions, or sustain justice. Resistance can shake the foundations of the old, but without revival, nothing new rises to replace what has been torn down. That is the danger of stopping at resistance. It leaves a vacuum, and vacuums are easily filled with the very things people sought to escape. Revival, however, carries a different energy. Revival looks beyond the frustration of today and asks, what kind of tomorrow do we want to build? Revival does not just confront what is wrong. It points to what is right. It gathers people not just around their pain, but around their shared hope. When a movement crosses from resistance into revival, it ceases to be merely reactive and becomes creative. It stops living only in the language of protest and begins to speak the language of destiny. The choice between resistance and revival also reveals the heart of leadership. If the leaders of a movement only stir up emotions, then the fire may burn hot, but it will also burn out quickly. But if leaders begin to channel that energy into strategy, discipline, and long-term vision, then what begins as resistance can blossom into revival. This is why leadership among Nepal's youth is so critical right now. The voices that are rising must not only shout against what is broken, but also chart a path toward what can be built. Without direction, energy is wasted. But with direction, energy is transformed into power. We must also understand that resistance often divides, while revival unites. Resistance can fracture people into camps of anger, each one voicing their own frustrations, but not always working together. Revival, on the other hand, calls people into a shared vision that transcends individual grievances. Revival says, we may not all agree on everything, but we agree that our nation must be renewed. In Nepal, if the youth can move beyond their frustrations and rally around a common purpose, they will discover that revival has the ability to unify where resistance only fragments. There is also a spiritual layer to this choice. Resistance is born in the natural, but revival is born in the spiritual. Resistance says, we will not accept the way things are. Revival says, we will call forth the way things should be. Resistance challenges the visible powers, but revival calls upon an invisible power that cannot be overthrown. Resistance focuses on tearing down idols. Revival focuses on lifting up truth. When Nepal's young people choose revival, they are not just fighting against something. They are aligning themselves with a greater purpose that gives their struggle eternal weight. And yet, revival does not erase resistance. It fulfills it. Revival gives meaning to resistance. The anger that fueled the streets becomes the passion that fuels reform. The frustration that brought people together becomes the determination that keeps them together. The disappointment that drove them to protest becomes the lesson that shapes wiser decisions for the future. Resistance alone is incomplete, but resistance transformed into revival becomes unstoppable. The history of nations shows us the same pattern over and over again. Revolts without vision collapse into chaos. Movements without strategy lose their momentum. But when resistance grows into revival, nations are reborn. Old systems crumble, but new systems rise. Brokenness is acknowledged, but wholeness begins to emerge. What is happening in Nepal is a familiar moment in history. The raw energy of resistance is alive. But the challenge is whether it will evolve into the life, giving power of revival. This crossroads is urgent because time is not neutral. A movement that lingers too long in resistance without stepping into revival risks losing its way. Energy fades, divisions increase, and frustration turns inward. But if revival is embraced quickly, the movement gains momentum that carries it forward, building rather than only breaking. Nepal's youth must realize that this moment is fragile. And what they do now will determine whether history remembers their movement as a burst of resistance or the beginning of a true revival. And so the tension grows. The chants in the streets echo resistance, but the hearts of the people long for revival. The voices are loud against what is wrong. But the question remains, will they be equally loud about what is right? The young people have awakened, their resistance has been heard, but the greater challenge is still before them. Will their passion be harnessed into vision? And will their anger be transformed into hope so that resistance becomes revival? Throughout history, whenever great shifts occurred, they were often ignited not by the old, but by the young. The same pattern we see in Nepal today echoes the stories recorded in Scripture, where God often placed his hand on those considered too young, too inexperienced, or too unqualified, yet used them to shape the destiny of nations. The revolt of Nepal's youth is not a random eruption. It is part of a timeless pattern where the young rise to confront giants, speak truth to power, and step into roles that history did not expect them to fill. Consider David, a shepherd boy, overlooked even by his own family, yet chosen to face Goliath when seasoned warriors trembled. David's youth was not a weakness but a weapon. His faith, his courage, his refusal to accept the fear that paralyzed others became the catalyst for victory. In the same way, Nepal's youth are facing giants, not of flesh and blood, but of corruption, injustice, and broken systems. They may not carry swords or shields, but their voices, their unity, and their determination are stones in their sling, aimed at the giants standing before their nation. Then there is Jeremiah, called as a prophet while still a youth. He tried to resist, declaring, "I am too young." But God told him not to say that, because his calling was greater than his age. In Nepal, many have dismissed the young as too inexperienced, too emotional, too unprepared to lead. But history teaches us that when God awakens a generation, he equips them for the task ahead. Just as Jeremiah's words pierced through hardened hearts, the cries of Nepal's young people are cutting through the excuses and dismissals of the powerful. Think of Esther, a young woman who entered her destiny at a moment when her people were threatened with destruction. She could have stayed silent, hidden behind her position, but she chose to risk her life and use her voice for the salvation of others. Nepal's youth carry a similar weight. They are not only fighting for themselves, they are speaking for generations yet unborn. Their courage is not selfish, it is generational. They stand not only for their own freedom, but for the future of their nation. Joseph, too, was a young man when visions of greatness were placed in his heart. Though betrayed, enslaved, and imprisoned, his destiny could not be denied. Eventually, he rose to become a ruler who saved nations in famine. The lesson is clear. Youth does not disqualify one from significance. In fact, it often becomes the very soil in which resilience is planted. Nepal's young generation may feel betrayed by their leaders, forgotten by their systems, and abandoned by those meant to protect them. But like Joseph, their struggle may be the very preparation for the leadership that will one day preserve their nation. Even the disciples of Jesus were mostly young men when they were called. They were fishermen, tax collectors, zealots, not scholars, not politicians, not the expected candidates for world-changing work. Yet those same young men carried the message of hope that turned the world upside down. Their youth was not a limitation, but an open vessel for divine power. In Nepal, the youth do not have the polished systems of the elite, but they have passion, courage, and a hunger for truth. And just as the disciples reshaped history, this generation has the potential to reshape their nation. We cannot overlook Samuel, the boy who heard God's voice while the priests around him had grown deaf to it. Sometimes it takes a child to hear what adults can no longer discern. The youth in Nepal are hearing cries that the older generation has ignored. They are sensing the urgency that leaders have grown numb to. Their ears are open to the call of justice, while others have adjusted themselves to corruption as if it were normal. Samuel's story reminds us that the freshness of youth often makes them more sensitive to what truly matters. Gideon, though hesitant and fearful, was young when he was called to lead Israel against their enemies. He doubted himself, but heaven saw strength in him that he did not yet see. Nepal's youth may feel the same, unsure of whether they have the strength to push forward, uncertain of how deep the road ahead will be. But within them is a strength they cannot yet measure. Like Gideon, they may be threshing wheat in secret today, but tomorrow they could be leading their nation out of oppression. And let us remember Timothy, mentored by Paul, who was reminded not to let anyone look down on him because of his youth, but to set an example in speech, conduct, love, faith, and purity. The awakening in Nepal is not only about anger, it is about example. These young voices have the chance to lead not just by protest, but by character, showing integrity where corruption ruled, showing unity where division thrived, and showing vision where others only saw despair. Their youth can be their testimony, their integrity, their authority. All of these stories reveal a pattern. When the young rise, it is often because the old have failed to carry the mantle faithfully. When leaders become blind, God opens the eyes of the next generation. When the established systems fall short, the fresh voices step in. Nepal's revolt is not an accident. It is part of the rhythm of history and the pattern of Scripture. The youth are stepping into the same stream that carried David, Jeremiah, Esther, Joseph, Samuel, Gideon, Timothy, and the disciples. A stream of destiny where young lives ignite change that ripples through generations. What is happening in Nepal right now is not merely about politics or leadership transitions. It is a struggle for the very soul of the nation's future. When young people pour into the streets, when their voices echo across cities and villages, they are not only protesting the failures of today, they are fighting for the shape of tomorrow. The decisions, sacrifices, and actions made in this moment will leave an imprint that generations to come will either rejoice in or regret. That is why this is not just another revolt. It is a battle for destiny itself. At the heart of this battle lies the question of identity. What kind of nation will Nepal choose to become? Will it be one that continues to operate under the weight of corruption and broken promises, or will it rise into a future where dignity, accountability, and justice are foundational truths? The youth are not just resisting policies. They are confronting an identity crisis. They are declaring that the future of Nepal must not be a repetition of its past, but a transformation into something greater, something righteous, something life-giving for every citizen. This battle is also generational in nature. For too long, the young have inherited systems built on compromises they did not choose. They have been asked to live with the consequences of decisions made before their time. But now, they are declaring that they will no longer passively accept what was handed down. The revolt is not simply about rejecting the failures of those who came before. It is about rewriting the story so that future generations will inherit something better. In this way, the battle for Nepal's future is also a battle for children yet unborn, whose lives will be shaped by what happens now. And let us be clear, every battle for the future is fought on the battleground of values. Corruption is not only about money, it is about the erosion of trust. Injustice is not only about law, it is about the denial of human dignity. Nepali youth are crying out because they recognize that values have been compromised, that leadership has failed to embody integrity, and that promises have been treated as disposable. Their voices are demanding more than reforms. They are demanding a restoration of values that will safeguard the future from repeating the mistakes of the past. The battle is also spiritual, though many may not see it. Darkness always seeks to control the future by suffocating the young. But when young people awaken, it is evidence that light is breaking through. The uprising in Nepal is not only about institutions and systems. It is about whether truth will have the final word. It is about whether deception will continue to dominate or whether transparency and justice will break into the open. Every nation has such moments when the soul of the future hangs in the balance. And this is Nepal's moment of decision. And in any battle for the future, there are always forces that resist change. Those in power often cling tightly to their positions, terrified of losing control. They label the cries of the people as reckless. They dismiss the protests as misguided. And they try to silence voices by intimidation. But history shows that when the battle is truly for the soul of the future, No amount of suppression can hold back the tide. Resistance from the powerful only confirms the urgency of the people's demand, making the revolt even more resolute. Yet this battle is not only external, it is internal. The youth of Nepal must confront not only corrupt systems, but also the temptation of despair. The fight for the future demands endurance, courage, and unity. If discouragement or division takes hold, the movement risks losing its way. But if they hold firm, if they remember that they are not just resisting for today, but building for tomorrow, then their struggle will carry meaning that outlasts their own generation. This inner battle is just as critical as the one being fought in the public square. The struggle for the future also demands vision. Without vision, even the loudest revolts eventually fade into memory. But with vision, a movement can carry its momentum into lasting transformation. The youth must not only cry out against what is broken, they must also paint a picture of what a renewed Nepal can look like. They must imagine systems of justice, education, opportunity, and integrity, and then work together to make that vision reality. The battle for the future cannot be won by anger alone. It must be sustained by hope and vision. And this battle is contagious. Other nations are watching. Other young people are paying attention. Nepal's youth are not only shaping their own destiny, they are sending a message to the world. Their courage tells others that the future belongs to those who dare to claim it, not to those who quietly accept what is given. Their resistance and hope remind the global community that the future is not written in stone, but can be reshaped by the determined voices of the young. The impact of their fight extends far beyond their borders. Every generation is given one defining battle, one critical moment where they must decide whether to remain silent or rise. For Nepal's Gen Z, this is that moment. They are standing in the gap between a broken past and a hopeful future, between corruption and accountability, between silence and voice. And as they fight for the future, they carry not just their own hopes, but the destiny of an entire nation resting upon their shoulders. What is happening in Nepal is not confined to Nepal alone. It is a megaphone that speaks to the nations. Every protest in the streets, every chant for justice, every demand for change is a reminder that truth cannot be buried forever. The youth of Nepal are not just speaking to their leaders, they are speaking to the world, declaring that silence in the face of corruption and oppression is no longer acceptable. Their courage has become a living parable, echoing across borders, challenging other nations to ask hard questions about their own conditions and their own future. When the young rise, the world takes notice, because their energy cannot be contained within a single boundary. The fire in Nepal is a spark that has the potential to ignite others, reminding us all that complacency is the enemy of progress. Those who sit in comfort in other lands cannot ignore the sound of young voices demanding change. Their cry reverberates like an alarm clock ringing across continents, shaking nations from their slumber. urging them to examine what has been tolerated for too long. And this message is not simply about rebellion. It is about responsibility. Nepal's youth are reminding the world that every generation carries a mandate, a calling to leave the world better than they found it. They are saying, in essence, that to accept corruption, injustice, or stagnation is to betray the next generation. Their voices call out to young people in other nations. Do not wait for someone else to fix what is broken. Do not assume the future will magically heal itself, for the responsibility rests with those who are willing to rise now. The world is also learning that youth movements are not weak, but powerful. For too long, the young have been underestimated, treated as inexperienced or naive. But history shows us that revolutions, reformations, and awakenings often begin with the courage of those who are young. The revolt in Nepal is a reminder to the global community that when the young unify with a clear voice, they can shake thrones, they can disrupt systems, and they can carve new paths where none existed before. Their message is not just for their leaders, but for leaders everywhere who think power can be hoarded indefinitely. This global message carries a warning as well. Nations that ignore the cries of their youth do so at their own peril. When leaders close their ears to the younger generation, when they dismiss their energy and their vision, they plant seeds of unrest that will one day grow into storms. Nepal's situation stands as a lesson to governments everywhere. The youth will not remain silent forever. The pressure of unmet expectations, the weight of broken promises, will always erupt. And when it does, it reshapes the landscape of a nation. But the message is not only one of warning, it is also one of hope. For in the midst of chaos, the world sees a generation that refuses to bow to despair. These young voices are not only rejecting what is broken, they are daring to believe in what can be rebuilt. They are telling the world that cynicism is not the only option, that apathy is not inevitable. Their resilience becomes a global testimony that hope is still alive, that courage still exists, and that the next generation is not content to inherit a world in ruins. This revolt also sends a challenge to the global community about solidarity. Will other nations stand only as spectators, or will they recognize their shared humanity with those who struggle? The youth of Nepal cry not only for themselves, but for every young person who feels unheard, unseen, and unvalued. Their fight asks the world, will you support those who stand for justice? Or will you continue to turn away until the flames are at your own doorstep? Their uprising forces the global conscience to wrestle with the question of responsibility to one another. And this message to the world also reminds us that the struggle for justice is universal. Corruption may wear different faces in different countries. Injustice may take different forms, but the root is the same. Systems built on selfishness rather than service. By rising, Nepal's youth shine a light that helps uncover hidden darkness in other places. Their revolt becomes a mirror, showing other nations what they have ignored, what they have tolerated, and what they have normalized. Their courage invites others to step into their own fight for truth and righteousness. Furthermore, this uprising reveals the unstoppable nature of truth. Lies may dominate for a season. Oppression may seem strong. But the world is learning once again that truth has a way of breaking chains. Nepal's young voices are demonstrating that when people align with truth, they become unstoppable. Because truth carries a power greater than political force or economic control. The world cannot dismiss such a demonstration, for it resonates with a universal longing for freedom and dignity that every heart understands. Ultimately, what is unfolding in Nepal becomes more than a local revolt. It becomes a global sermon. It declares to every nation, every leader, every citizen, that the future belongs to those who refuse to accept bondage as normal. It proclaims that young voices matter, that justice matters, that truth matters, and that the world is interconnected in ways we cannot deny. Their fight is not just theirs. It belongs to humanity itself, because every step they take forward becomes a step forward for all who dream of a world that is more just, more free, and more true. Family, let me tell you something today. When God is getting ready to place something big in your life, something beyond your strength, something you can't manufacture with your own two hands, He doesn't just drop it in your lap. No, He prepares you and He gives you signs that you are standing on the edge of breakthrough. Opposition has a way of showing up right at the moment when you are closest to stepping into something greater. It almost feels unfair. You pray, you fast, you trust God, and then suddenly the attacks come from places you never expected. People who once supported you start questioning you. Circumstances that once seemed calm begin to shake, and challenges that were never there before suddenly rise up like mountains in your path. That's because the enemy can see the movement of heaven in your direction. He may not know the full detail of what God is about to release in your life, but he can sense that you're about to walk into new territory. And so he tries to build walls of intimidation around you. The opposition you face is not random. It is strategic resistance aimed at keeping you from crossing the threshold of breakthrough. Think about how Israel had to face the giants of Canaan. After 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, the promise was finally in front of them. But it wasn't vacant land waiting for them to casually walk in. There were fortified cities, armed enemies, and people who looked much stronger than them. The land God had promised was occupied by opposition. Why? Because every great promise attracts a great battle. The magnitude of your resistance often matches the magnitude of your calling. So when the opposition rises, it is a sign that something extraordinary is on the other side. Sometimes the opposition comes in the form of criticism. People won't understand the dream God planted in your spirit. They'll call it unrealistic. They'll mock your faith. And they'll try to plant seeds of doubt in your heart. Other times it comes as unexpected setbacks. Plans falling apart, doors shutting, finances tightening, health weakening. You'll wonder why everything seems to get harder right when you've decided to trust God for more. But that's the pattern. The moment before elevation is almost always marked by resistance. The enemy will not waste his energy fighting something that poses no threat. His warfare is an indirect complement to your destiny. It's in those seasons that faith must shift from theory to reality. When opposition grows, your dependence on God must deepen. You can't fight spiritual battles with fleshly weapons. You can't overcome giants with your own strength. You have to lean into the God who has already promised victory. That's why the opposition is also a training ground. It strips away false confidence and pushes you into radical trust. It reminds you that the blessing was never about your ability, but about God's power working through you. The harder the enemy pushes, the louder God whispers. Sometimes in the middle of opposition, you'll notice God giving you little reminders that He is still with you. A scripture will jump off the page right when you need it. A sermon will confirm exactly what you were praying about, or a stranger will encourage you in ways they couldn't have known you needed. These are divine breadcrumbs, little signs along the path to remind you that the opposition is not the final word. They are heaven's way of keeping your spirit aligned when everything around you looks chaotic. The Red Sea moment is another picture of this. Israel was finally walking out of slavery and right at the edge of freedom. Pharaoh's army chased them down. The people panicked because the obstacle in front and the army behind looked like a trap. But God used that very opposition to reveal His power in a way they had never seen before. The sea parted and the enemy was swallowed up. The opposition was not there to destroy them. It was there to demonstrate God's glory. That's what happens when you face unusual resistance. God positions the battle so that His power can be revealed in your life in undeniable ways. You'll also find that opposition exposes what's inside of you. It tests your endurance, your patience, your worship. It shows you whether your faith is rooted in circumstances or in the unchanging character of God. Some people fall away when resistance comes because they never built their foundation deep. Others press in harder, worship louder, and cling tighter. The opposition separates the casual from the committed. And in that process, it prepares you to carry the weight of the blessing you've been praying for. At times, the opposition will make you question whether you even heard God correctly. You'll start second, guessing every step. Did I misunderstand His voice? Did I take the wrong path? But remember, even Jesus was led into the wilderness by the Spirit right before He stepped into public ministry. He was tempted, tested, and pressed, not because He was outside of God's will, but because He was exactly where He was supposed to be. Opposition doesn't always mean you're on the wrong path. More often it means you're right. where you need to be. Every battle you face is also equipping you for the size of the promise. If God let you walk into something big without the resistance, you wouldn't have the spiritual muscles to hold it. The opposition builds endurance, sharpens your discernment, and deepens your prayer life. By the time you step into the blessing, you'll be stronger, wiser, and more grounded than you would have been without the fight. The struggle becomes preparation for the stewardship of what's coming. So don't misinterpret the opposition. Don't see it as a sign of defeat. Don't see it as God abandoning you. See it as confirmation. The bigger the opposition, the closer you are to breakthrough. The giants only show up when the promised land is near. The resistance is not proof that God is against you. It's proof that heaven's assignment over your life is too great to go uncontested. There are moments in life when you begin to sense a holy restlessness stirring deep inside of you. What once brought you comfort, what once felt like enough, suddenly feels too small. The routines that used to give you satisfaction no longer carry the same weight. The places you once called home start to feel unfamiliar, almost as if your spirit has outgrown them. That's because God is stretching you for something greater. He is preparing you for a new assignment, a bigger blessing, a season that requires more capacity than the one you're leaving behind. And the first sign of that preparation is that inner uneasiness that refuses to let you settle where you are. This restlessness is not the same as discontentment. Discontentment comes from ingratitude. But holy restlessness comes from vision. It is God stirring something inside of you that tells you there is more. You could be doing well on the outside, and people may even admire where you are. But inside you feel a pull, a divine tug that whispers, "You're not done yet. There's another level waiting." It is a reminder that you were not created to get comfortable in the wilderness when the promised land is ahead. That unsettled feeling is God's way of loosening your grip on what's familiar so that you can step into what's next. Sometimes that restlessness shows up in your job. You've done well, you've built a career, but all of a sudden the passion that once drove you isn't there anymore. It's not that you've become lazy or careless. It's that your assignment is shifting. Other times it shows up in relationships. People you once connected with on every level no longer feel aligned with your spirit. The conversations that once fed you now feel empty. God uses that misalignment to show you that He's moving you into circles that match your next season. The uneasiness is not punishment, it's positioning. When God is about to enlarge your territory, He will not let you stay satisfied in a place that can't contain what He's about to pour into you. Think of it like a seed planted in a pot. For a time, the pot is enough. The soil feeds it. The space allows it to grow. But eventually the roots press against the sides. The plant becomes restless, not because it is unhealthy, but because it has outgrown its container. That's how God deals with us. He lets us feel the pressure of limitation so that we'll recognize it's time to be replanted in bigger soil. This holy restlessness can feel confusing. You may start asking yourself, why don't I feel satisfied anymore? Why does everything feel off? The enemy will try to convince you that something is wrong with you. But what is happening is that God is expanding your spirit before he expands your circumstances. He gives you a glimpse of more, so that when the new door opens, you will have the courage to walk through it. If you stayed comfortable, you'd never move. So God makes comfort impossible, pushing you into a place where change becomes necessary. Look at how Abraham was called. He was comfortable in his father's house, surrounded by his people, living a life that made sense. But then God stirred him with a vision of something greater, a land he had never seen, a promise he had never imagined. That call created restlessness. He could not stay where he was because his destiny was tied to somewhere else. In the same way, when God plants vision in your spirit, he won't let you stay settled in places that cannot handle the weight of that vision. You'll notice, too, that the restlessness often comes before you have all the answers. God rarely gives the full blueprint. Instead, he allows the uneasiness to grow until it pushes you to seek him more deeply. You may not know what the next season looks like, but you know this one cannot hold you anymore. And in that tension, you are drawn into deeper prayer, more fasting, more worship, because you're trying to discern the direction of the shift. The restlessness becomes the catalyst for intimacy with God. This process also separates desire from destiny. Not every longing in your heart is from God, but the restlessness that he places there carries his fingerprints. It won't let you sleep. It won't let you ignore it. And it won't go away with temporary distractions. You can try to bury yourself in work, entertainment, or even religion, but the stirring will persist. That's because it's not just your idea. It's divine agitation, heaven's way of keeping you moving toward a bigger assignment. And sometimes that restlessness will come with loss. Things you loved will no longer fit. Opportunities you wanted will slip away. People you leaned on will drift. It hurts. But it's all part of God's way of clearing the ground. He makes sure you don't stay trapped in what you've outgrown. He prays your fingers off of the temporary so that your hands are open to receive the eternal. You may cry, you may wrestle, but deep down you know the shift is necessary because the old season no longer has the capacity to carry your future. When God gives you something big, he first gives you an inner discontent with the small. He doesn't let you settle in a place that's beneath the calling he has placed over your life. That holy restlessness is his way of telling you that enlargement is near, that growth is on the horizon, and that you're being prepared for more than you could have imagined. When God is about to entrust you with something bigger than yourself, one of the most evident signs is the appearance of divine connections. These are not casual acquaintances or random encounters. These are people strategically placed by God to help align you with your destiny. They show up at moments when you feel you can't move forward on your own. And their presence confirms that you are not meant to walk into your next season in isolation. Divine connections carry wisdom, opportunities, and resources that your natural strength could never secure. They are heaven-sent helpers assigned to push you closer to what God has ordained for you. Oftentimes, divine connections appear unexpectedly. You may cross paths with someone in an ordinary setting, a workplace, a church service, even a casual meeting, and realize later that God orchestrated the encounter. Their influence, their counsel, or their generosity becomes the very thing that unlocks a door you've been praying for. These connections are proof that God works through people to accomplish His purposes. He never intended for you to fulfill destiny in isolation. So He positions the right people to walk with you. It's important to understand that divine connections are not always flashy or influential in the way the world sees influence. Sometimes they come in the form of mentors who quietly pour wisdom into you, friends who pray for you when no one else knows your struggles, or colleagues who open doors in unexpected ways. What makes them divine is not their title or status, but the fact that they carry something God knew you would need for your journey. They may not stay with you forever, but their presence in your life is a sign that God is aligning you for something bigger. Scripture gives us countless examples of divine connections. David had Jonathan, whose loyalty preserved his life when Saul wanted him dead. Ruth had Naomi, whose guidance positioned her in the fields of Boaz, leading to her destiny. Esther had Mordecai, who counseled her into the palace for such a time as this. Each of these connections was ordained by God, and without them, the story would not have unfolded as it did. In the same way, when God is preparing you for a bigger blessing, He will not leave you without people who know how to point you in the right direction. There are times when God will even remove certain people from your life so that He can make space for divine connections. You may feel the sting of separation, the ache of losing long-time companions, but God knows what you need for the next season. Not everyone has the capacity to walk with you into greater territory. Some people are tied to your history, but not to your destiny. And God will make sure that when it's time to step into something big, you are surrounded by the right voices. These connections often show up with timing that feels almost supernatural. You might have been praying for clarity, struggling with decisions, or waiting for provision, and then someone shows up with exactly what you need. They speak a word that confirms your prayers. They introduce you to someone who has the resources, or they guide you with wisdom that saves you years of trial and error. It becomes clear that God used them as instruments to carry you closer to your purpose. That's not chance. That's divine orchestration. It's also worth noting that divine connections are not always comfortable. Sometimes they challenge you, confront you, and push you out of your comfort zone. They see potential in you that you can't see in yourself, and they refuse to let you stay small. Their presence disrupts your complacency, but in doing so, they sharpen you for what God has ahead. Iron sharpens iron, and divine connections are often the iron God uses to prepare you for greater responsibility. You may also recognize divine connections by the peace you feel in your spirit when they arrive. Even if the relationship is new, something inside you knows that this person was sent by God. The alignment feels natural, and their presence carries confirmation. They don't drain you, they strengthen you. They don't distract you from God's purpose. They propel you toward it. That sense of peace is one of the ways the Spirit affirms that this connection is not ordinary, but heavenly assigned. As you move closer to destiny, you'll also find that divine connections often come in layers. One person introduces you to another, who connects you to another, until suddenly you find yourself in circles you could never have entered on your own. This network is not man-made, it is God's design, preparing you for the weight of what He's about to give you. Each connection builds on the other until you realize that only God could have written such a sequence of encounters. And while divine connections bring blessing, they also require discernment. Not every person who enters your life is sent by God. Some are distractions meant to derail you. That is why prayer and discernment are critical. But when the right people show up, when their presence aligns with God's word, when their influence leads you closer to Him, and when their timing matches the season, you can know without a doubt that you are standing in the presence of divine connections, sent to help you step into something bigger than you imagined. One of the most undeniable signs that God is about to place something big in your life is the flow of unexpected provision. It is when doors begin to open in places you never knocked, and resources begin to arrive from directions you never anticipated. This provision doesn't make sense in the natural because it isn't tied to your effort alone. It is tied to God's promise. When He sets a plan in motion, He also ensures that the supply meets the vision. What He initiates, He funds. And when you are about to step into something greater, you will start to see needs met in ways that remind you only God could have done it. Unexpected provision comes in many forms. Sometimes it looks like financial blessings, checks in the mail, debts forgiven, promotions you weren't even in line for. Other times it looks like favor, where people go out of their way to help you, giving you access to opportunities you could not have secured yourself. And sometimes it shows up in practical ways, like a door opening for housing, transportation, or even relationships that carry the resources you lacked. However it comes, you know it's God, because it arrives at the exact moment you need it most. Right when you thought you had run out of options. When Israel walked through the wilderness, God fed them with manna from heaven. They couldn't farm. They couldn't hunt enough to feed millions, and yet bread rained down daily. That was unexpected provision. It taught them to trust that even in barren places, God has ways of sustaining his people. When water flowed out of a rock, it was another reminder that God can provide from the most unlikely sources. In your life, you may find that blessings flow from places you least expect. Jobs you never applied for, friends you didn't know you needed, doors that were locked suddenly swinging open. That is God's pattern of provision. This provision often arrives at a point where you are stretched thin. God allows your resources to dry up just enough so you know it wasn't your own strength that carried you. He lets the bank account hit low, the opportunity shrink, the support fade, so that when provision comes, you can't point to yourself. You can only point to him. That way, when you step into the bigger blessing, you will know beyond a shadow of a doubt that the source was divine. The unexpected provision is not just about supply, it's about building testimony. Sometimes this provision also comes through people who don't even know why they're helping you. Pharaoh's daughter raised Moses though he was supposed to be her enemy. The ravens fed Elijah, though they were unclean birds. Even those who have no intention of blessing, you can end up being used by God as vessels of provision. He can move the hearts of kings, bosses, strangers, and even adversaries to ensure his purpose in your life is fulfilled. That's why you should never discount where help might come from. God's provision is not limited to the obvious. What makes unexpected provision powerful is the timing. It arrives in seasons where you feel most unprepared, most inadequate, or most vulnerable. That's when God demonstrates that he is your provider. You may be praying for a miracle, not knowing that he has already sent someone on the way with what you need. By the time you are about to give up, the door opens, the phone call comes, the opportunity presents itself. The timing is so perfect that you know God had already orchestrated it long before you even realized the need. And this kind of provision doesn't always come in abundance all at once. Sometimes it comes in daily bread portions, just enough for today, just enough to keep moving, just enough to remind you that you depend on him. The bigger blessing requires greater faith, and so God trains you through these small doses of provision. He teaches you not to hoard, but to trust. Not to panic, but to pray. Not to rely on resources, but on the source. Each moment of unexpected provision is both a supply and a lesson in many cases. Unexpected provision will also challenge you to step out in faith. God will give you just enough for the next step, not the entire journey. He won't drop everything in your lap because he wants you to keep moving forward, trusting him along the way. The resources show up as you walk, not before you move. That's why many people miss it. They wait for the full provision before they take the first step. But the pattern of God is to provide while you are on the journey. As Abraham climbed the mountain, the ram was already waiting in the thicket, but he didn't see it until he got to the place of sacrifice. This provision also silences the critics. People may wonder how you're still standing, how you're still progressing, how you're still building, when by all accounts you should have run out. They may know your bank account, your background, or your connections don't line up with what you're walking into. And yet, doors open for you. Opportunities fall into place. Resources come together. That's when they realize that something bigger than human effort is at work. God uses unexpected provision to show others his hand in your life. At its core, unexpected provision is a sign of God's faithfulness. It reminds you that he doesn't give vision without supply, and he doesn't call you without equipping you. Each blessing, each open door, each resource is confirmation that you are on the path to something greater. The provision is not random. It is intentional alignment from heaven to ensure you are ready for the big thing God is about to release into your life. When God is preparing you for something big, one of the clearest signs is the surge of spiritual warfare inside of you. Suddenly, your emotions seem heavier, your thoughts more chaotic, and your spirit more burdened than usual. You wake up feeling pressed without a clear reason, and even small challenges feel magnified. This is not coincidence. It is the enemy intensifying the battle within because he knows something powerful is about to be birthed through you. Just as a woman goes into labor pains before delivery, the inner warfare is evidence that something significant is about to come forth. This warfare doesn't always come from external attacks. Sometimes it's a battle in your own mind. Doubt begins to whisper louder, telling you that you're not qualified, that you've made too many mistakes, that you don't have what it takes. Fear rises up, painting pictures of failure before you even take the first step. Anxiety tries to choke your peace, making you second-guess every decision. This internal struggle is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign of transition. The enemy knows that if he can defeat you in your thoughts, he can delay what God is trying to deliver in your life. At times, the warfare shows up in your body. You may experience exhaustion, sickness, or strange afflictions right when you're on the verge of breakthrough. The weight of stress feels heavier, and your strength feels drained. The enemy targets your physical state because he wants you too weary to pursue the promise. But even in those moments, you have to remember that the battle is spiritual first. The weariness you feel, the natural often mirrors the warfare happening in the unseen. That's why prayer and perseverance become weapons, because they shift the atmosphere beyond what your eyes can see. Spiritual warfare also intensifies through temptation. The enemy knows your weak spots, and in times of transition, he turns up the pressure. Old habits try to resurface. Old relationships try to pull you back. And opportunities that look good, but aren't God begin to appear. These are distractions meant to derail you right before you step into destiny. If you are not discerning, you may mistake them as blessings, when in reality they are counterfeits designed to sabotage the real thing God has prepared. Recognizing the difference between distraction and destiny becomes crucial during these seasons of warfare. Sometimes the warfare is relational. People close to you may suddenly turn against you, misunderstand you, or create conflict that wears you down emotionally. Relationships you thought were stable begin to feel shaky. The enemy loves to sow division in moments of growth because he knows that strife can drain your energy and cloud your focus. These relational battles are not about the people themselves, but about the spiritual forces working behind the scenes to keep you from moving forward. Another layer of this warfare is the silence of God. There are seasons where, in the middle of the storm, heaven feels quiet. You pray, you cry, you wait, but it seems as though God is distant. That silence can shake your faith if you're not anchored. Yet it is in these moments that God is building your endurance, teaching you to trust His presence, even when His voice seems hidden. The silence is not abandonment, it is preparation, sharpening your ability to walk by faith and not by sight. You'll also notice that warfare increases when you take steps of obedience. Every time you say yes to God, resistance rises. Every act of faith provokes the enemy because obedience is the doorway to blessing. That's why the inner battles get stronger. Right after you make a decision to follow God more closely, the enemy wants to make you regret your obedience. But in reality, the resistance is proof that your obedience is powerful. It is shifting something in the spirit. And the opposition is confirmation that your yes carries weight. The warfare inside of you often reveals the magnitude of what's coming. Small battles precede small blessings, but intense battles precede great breakthroughs. The greater the struggle, the greater the promise waiting on the other side. Just like labor pains increase right before delivery, your spiritual battles intensify because the blessing is close. What feels like pressure meant to crush you is actually pressure meant to push you into destiny. This inner battle also exposes where your faith is anchored. Do you believe only when it's easy, or can you hold on when everything in you wants to quit? Do you trust God only when you feel strong, or can you lean on Him when your strength is gone? Warfare has a way of stripping away shallow faith and forcing you to stand on the unshakable promises of God. It pulls you out of dependency on your own power and teaches you to fight with prayer, worship, and the Word. Even though the warfare feels overwhelming, it is also a refining fire. It purges your spirit, clears your focus, and strengthens your character. You come out of the battle wiser, stronger, and more prepared to handle the weight of the blessing. Without the warfare, you wouldn't be equipped to sustain the magnitude of what God is about to release. That's why the presence of inner conflict is not random. It is the evidence that's preparing you for something bigger than you imagined, One of the clearest signs that God is preparing to release something big in your life is when you begin to experience peace that makes no sense. This peace is not tied to circumstances, not connected to whether everything around you is calm, and not dependent on whether you can see the full picture. It is a supernatural calm that settles in your spirit even when storms are raging all around you. You may not understand why you feel steady, but deep down there is a quiet assurance that somehow, some way, God is working it all together for your good. This kind of peace defies logic. People may look at your situation and expect you to be falling apart, but instead you're composed. Bills may be piling up. Relationships may be shifting. Opportunities may feel delayed. Yet you carry yourself with a steadiness that surprises even you. That's because this peace doesn't come from what's happening externally. It comes from who is holding you internally. It is the peace Jesus spoke of when he said, "Oh, my peace I give to you, not as the world gives. It is a peace the world cannot manufacture and the enemy cannot steal." Often, this peace shows up right after a season of deep struggle. You may have cried, wrestled, and questioned everything. But at some point, a divine calm begins to wash over you. It's almost like God whispers to your heart, "Be still and know that I am God." Suddenly, the panic quiets, the fear loses its grip, and the questions no longer torment you the way they did before. The situation may not have changed yet, but something inside you has shifted. That inner assurance is a sign that you are close to seeing God release something bigger than you imagined. This peace also guards your mind. In the middle of warfare, anxiety tries to invade, but peace acts as a shield, protecting you from mental collapse. Instead of spiraling in fear, you find yourself able to rest. Instead of obsessing over every what if, you find the strength to trust the what is of God's promise. The peace doesn't remove the battle, but it gives you the ability to stand in the middle of it without breaking. It is like being in the eye of a storm, chaos swirling around, yet calmness covering you where you stand. One of the most powerful aspects of this peace is how it influences your decisions. Normally, pressure makes people act out of desperation. They rush into choices, grasp at anything, and move in fear rather than faith. But when you are covered in supernatural peace, you are able to wait on God. You're not easily swayed by panic, and you don't settle for less just because waiting is uncomfortable. That peace gives you the patience to hold out for the promise instead of grabbing a counterfeit. It positions you to make decisions aligned with destiny rather than decisions driven by fear. This peace also becomes a testimony to others. People will notice that something about you is different. They may ask how you can stay so calm when they know your life is under pressure. That peace becomes a witness, pointing them not to your strength, but to the God who sustains you. Your life begins to shine as evidence that faith is real. And that trusting God produces results the world cannot explain. In that way, your peace not only carries you, but also ministers to those watching you. At times, this peace feels unexplainable because it doesn't remove the reality of the storm. The bills are still there. The diagnosis may still be present. The conflict may still exist. Yet there is no panic. That's because peace is not the absence of trouble. It is the presence of God. When He wraps your heart in assurance, the storm loses its power to control you. You learn that you don't need every question answered when you have the one who holds every answer already with you. This peace also stabilizes your emotions. Instead of living on the roller coaster of highs and lows, you begin to find consistency in your spirit. Even when challenges hit, you don't react the same way you used to. You don't collapse. You don't lash out. You don't lose your footing as easily. There is a maturity in you produced by that peace that allows you to handle pressure with grace. That stability is preparation for the bigger blessing, because what God is about to give you will require a steadiness that only His peace can cultivate. Another dimension of this peace is how it recenters your focus. Without peace, it's easy to fixate on problems, magnifying them until they look bigger than God. But with peace, your perspective shifts. You stop staring at the mountain and start remembering the one who moves mountains. You stop obsessing over how impossible it looks and start declaring that with God all things are possible. Peace shifts your gaze upward, and in doing so, it strengthens your faith to endure until the promise manifests. And in many ways, this peace is the confirmation that the breakthrough is near. Right before God releases something major, He often settles your spirit in a way that tells you it's already done. Even if nothing has changed on the outside, there is a knowing on the inside that victory is sealed. That quiet confidence is not denial. It is faith dressed in peace. It is the supernatural calm that comes only when heaven is backing you and destiny is unfolding right before your eyes. My brothers and sisters, if you are waiting for God to move in your life, then hear me clearly. Miracles don't come to those who are sitting down in faith. They come to those who are standing up in faith. Because when God moves, He doesn't move by accident. He moves with intention. He moves with power. He moves on purpose. And the question is not if God can move. The question is, are you in position to receive what He's already prepared? When it comes to seeing God move in your life, obedience is not optional, it's essential. Obedience is the bridge between the promise and the provision. It's the spiritual posture that prepares you to receive what God has already ordained. God is not in the business of blessing disobedience. He's not going to pour His miracles into a vessel that refuses to follow His direction. If you want to experience the supernatural, if you want to see God intervene in a way that leaves no doubt it was Him, you must be walking in alignment with what He has already spoken. Let me tell you something. Obedience is often inconvenient. It rarely fits into our schedule. It often defies logic. But that's the very reason it's powerful. Because when you obey God, despite your feelings, despite your fears, despite your circumstances, you're saying, God, I trust you more than I trust what I see. That's faith. And faith without obedience is nothing but lip service. Obedience is faith in action. It's the evidence that you believe God is who he says he is, and that he will do what he said he would do. Think about the story of Peter in Luke chapter 5. He had been fishing all night and caught nothing. He was tired, he was discouraged, he was probably frustrated. But then Jesus comes along and tells him to go out into the deep and let down his nets again. Now, from a human perspective, that made no sense. Peter was a professional fisherman. Jesus was a carpenter. Peter had been out there all night. He knew the waters. He knew the patterns. But Jesus gave a word. And Peter, though he didn't understand it, though it went against his instincts, said something powerful. Nevertheless, at your word, I will let down the net. And when he did, the miracle came. The net broke. The boat began to sink. The blessing was so big it couldn't be contained. But don't miss the lesson. It wasn't Peter's skill that brought the miracle. It wasn't his experience. It wasn't his effort. It was his obedience. The miracle came on the other side of submission. God didn't need Peter's expertise. He needed his trust. That's the kind of obedience that positions you for a miracle. The kind that says, even when I don't feel it, even when I don't see it, even when I don't agree with it, because you said it, Lord, I will do it, that's when heaven responds. That's when God moves. You want to see walls fall? Obey. You want to see chains break? Obey. Now, some people want the miracle without the instruction. They want the breakthrough without the burden of obedience. But let me tell you, God doesn't operate like a vending machine. You don't get to punch in your request and bypass the requirement. God blesses where there is alignment. And alignment requires submission. Obedience is the proof that your will is surrendered to his. We love to quote Jeremiah 29:11. For I know the plans I have for you, says the Lord, plans to prosper you. But we don't always like to read what comes before or after. God's plan for your prosperity is connected to your willingness to follow his process. And sometimes that process doesn't make sense. Sometimes it stretches you. Sometimes it strips you. But it's all designed to shape you into the person who can carry what he's about to release in your life. God doesn't just want to bless you, he wants to trust you. And trust is proven through obedience. Can he trust you to do what he says, even when it's hard? Can he trust you to stay faithful when no one else sees? Can he trust you to keep walking when the path is unclear? Obedience is where trust is built, and trust is the foundation for divine release. Let's not forget about Abraham. God told him to leave everything familiar, his country, his people, his father's house, and go to a land that he would show him. Not a land he had already mapped out, not a land with a GPS route. Just go and I'll show you. And Abraham went. That's radical obedience. And because of it, God made him the father of many nations. Generations were blessed because of one man's willingness to say yes to God even when he didn't have the full picture. Some of us are missing out on our miracle because we're waiting for clarity when God is waiting for obedience. We want the details before we decide. But that's not how faith works. God gives you a word and then he watches what you do with it. He says, forgive, and you say, but they hurt me. He says, tithe, and you say, but my budget is tight. He says, serve, and you say, but I'm tired. What you're doing in that moment is putting conditions on your obedience. And conditional obedience is just polite rebellion. God is not obligated to bless what he didn't instruct. Some of us are asking God to bless relationships he told us not to get into, to prosper jobs he didn't assign us, to heal wounds we keep reopening through disobedience. But here's the good news. It's not too late. The moment you align with his will, the moment you submit to his word, the door to the miraculous begins to open again. You don't have to be perfect, but you do have to be obedient. So if you want to position yourself for a miracle, start by doing the last thing God told you to do. Go back to that instruction. Go back to that assignment. Go back to that word. Your next breakthrough might not require a new word. It might require action on the old one. Because when God sees obedience, he releases overflow. When he sees submission, he responds with power. And when he sees trust, he moves mountains. Expectation is the seedbed of miracles. It's the atmosphere where God moves. You see, God responds not just to need, but to faith, faith that expects him to show up. Faith that believes he will do what he said he would do. Faith that prepares a place for the answer before it ever arrives. When you expect something from God, you live like the answer is already in motion, like heaven is already working behind the scenes. And let me tell you something. That kind of faith gets God's attention. Too many of us are praying with our mouths, but doubting in our hearts. We say we believe, but we don't prepare. We ask God to open the door, but we don't get dressed to walk through it. That's not faith. That's wishful thinking. Real faith is visible. It shows up in your posture, your preparation, your praise, and your persistence. When you expect God to move, you don't wait until the blessing arrives to celebrate. You start celebrating because you know the blessing is on the way. Look at the story of Elijah in 1 Kings 18. There had been a drought in the land for 3.5 years. No rain, no clouds, no sign of change. But then Elijah goes up to Mount Carmel and tells his servant, go look toward the sea. The servant goes and sees nothing. Elijah says, go again, not once, not twice, but 7 times. And on the 7th time, the servant sees a cloud the size of a man's hand. Now, some of us would have given up after the first look. Some of us would have stopped praying after the second report. But Elijah had expectation in his spirit. He didn't see the cloud the first 6 times, but he kept sending the servant. Why? Because he expected God to move. He expected the rain to come. And when he saw just a hint of the answer, he didn't wait. He said, hurry up, tell Ahab to get in his chariot, because I hear the sound of an abundance of rain. That's expectation. That's the kind of faith that calls a cloud the size of a hand an abundance. That's the kind of belief that doesn't need full evidence to rejoice. Some of us are waiting for the whole sky to be filled before we move. But God is asking, can you praise me for the small sign? Can you prepare based on a whisper? Can you believe before you see? See, when a woman is pregnant, she doesn't wait until the baby is born to start preparing the nursery. No, she prepares in expectation of what's coming. She paints the walls, she buys the clothes, she picks out the name, not because she sees the baby yet, but because she knows the baby is coming. That's the posture God is looking for from his people. Prepare the room, build the crib, clear the space. Who's in expectation? Jesus often asks people, do you believe I am able to do this? He wasn't asking for information. He was checking their expectation, because your belief sets the boundaries for what God can do in your life. If you don't expect anything, you won't receive anything. If you expect small, you'll get small. If you believe God can't or won't, you've already closed the door to the miraculous. But if you can believe, Jesus said, all things are possible. Think about the crippled man at the beautiful gate in Acts 3. He was sitting there begging for money. That's all he thought he could get. But when Peter and John approached him, the Bible says he looked at them expecting to receive something. Now, he expected money, but God had more. Peter said, silver and gold I do not have, but what I do have, I give you. In the name of Jesus Christ of Nazareth, rise up and walk. That man got more than he expected. Why? Because he had the right posture. He was looking up. He was in position. And even though he didn't know what was coming, he expected something. And when you expect something from God, even if you don't know what it will look like, God will exceed your expectation with his provision. God doesn't just want you to believe in his existence. He wants you to believe in his activity. Expect him to intervene. Expect him to heal. Expect him to provide. Expect him to make a way. Don't just pray. Pray and plan. Don't just hope. Hope and prepare. Faith is not passive, it's active. It reaches forward, it anticipates. It gets things ready before the answer shows up. If you're asking God to bring rain, you better dig a ditch. If you're asking God to open a door, you better get your bag packed. If you're asking God to send provision, you better start building the vessel that can hold it. Because expectation makes room. Expectation stretches faith. Expectation puts you in position to receive what God has already declared. You can't have expectation and stay the same. When you really believe that God is about to do something, your language changes. Your habits change. Your prayers change. You stop begging and start thanking. You stop reacting and start preparing. You stop worrying and start worshiping. Why? Because you know the God who promised is faithful. So if it looks dry right now, if it looks empty, if it looks like nothing is happening, don't stop expecting. Don't stop believing. The silence is not absence. The waiting is not denial. Keep your eyes on the horizon. Because even if all you see is a small cloud, that cloud is evidence that the rain is on the way. That cloud is proof that God heard you, and if he heard you, he will move. Surrender is not weakness, it is wisdom. When you surrender to God, you are not giving up, you are giving over. You're taking your plans, your preferences, your timing, and your strategies and laying them down at the feet of the one who sees the end from the beginning. And let me tell you, nothing positions you for a miracle faster than surrender. Because surrender says to God, I trust you more than I trust me. It says, I am no longer the captain of this ship. I'm handing you the wheel. And when God is in control, that's when supernatural things begin to happen. There's a reason why God will often wait until we're out of options before he shows up. It's because as long as we think we can fix it, as long as we're trying to make it happen ourselves, we'll always take the credit. But God doesn't share his glory. He wants to move in such a way that when the miracle comes, you'll have no choice but to say, This was the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes. That's why surrender is so powerful. It gets you out of the way so he can step in. Look at Abraham on Mount Moriah. God had promised him a son, Isaac, the son of the covenant, the child through whom the entire nation of Israel would come. And then one day God tells Abraham, take your son, your only son, the one you love, and offer him to me as a sacrifice. Now that made no sense. Isaac was the promise. Isaac was the future. Isaac was the miracle. But Abraham obeyed. He saddled the donkey, took the wood and the knife, and walked up that mountain. It wasn't until Abraham raised the knife in surrender that the angel of the Lord stopped him and revealed the ram in the bush. Hear me. The provision was already there, but it was hidden until Abraham surrendered. The ram didn't show up when he left home. It didn't show up halfway up the mountain. It appeared when he laid it all down, because provision is released at the point of surrender. You may not see what you need right now because you haven't let go of what you're trying to control. God didn't need Isaac. He needed Abraham's heart. And when he saw that Abraham was willing to surrender, that's when he moved. Surrender is not a one-time event. It's a daily decision. Every morning you wake up and say, Lord, not my will, but yours be done. And that's hard sometimes because we like control. We like knowing what's next. We like calling the shots. But God doesn't bless control. He blesses trust. When you surrender, you're saying, God, even if you don't do it the way I want, I still trust you to do it right. That's mature faith. That's the kind of posture that opens the door for miracles. Look at Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, fully God, yet fully man, wrestling with the weight of the cross. And he prayed, Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. That was surrender. That was the greatest act of obedience and trust the world has ever seen. And because of that surrender, salvation came to all of us. If Jesus had not submitted, the miracle of the resurrection would never have come. There is no resurrection without surrender. There is no breakthrough without letting go. Some of us are praying for God to do something big, but we're still holding on to what he told us to release. We want a miracle, but we won't give up the relationship he told us to walk away from. We want direction, but we won't lay down our own agenda. We want his power, but we're still clinging to pride. Let me be clear, God can't fill. If your hands are full of your own plans, your own efforts, your own understanding, then there's no room for him to deposit what he has for you. Think about the Israelites in the wilderness. God provided manna from heaven, water from a rock, clothes that didn't wear out, but he only gave them enough for each day. If they tried to store it up, it spoiled. Why? Because he was teaching them to depend on him daily. Surrender is not about a backup plan. It's not about trusting God until you find something better. It's about leaning on him completely, moment by moment, trusting that he is your source and your sustainer. And sometimes God will strip things away just to get you to the place of surrender. He'll close doors you wanted open. He'll end relationships you thought were forever. He'll shut down opportunities that looked perfect, not to hurt you, but to position you. Because he knows what you don't. He sees what you can't. And what feels like loss is often preparation for increase. But you won't see it until you release it. God is not looking for performers, he's looking for surrenderers. He's not after talent, he's after trust. He's not moved by how strong you are, he's moved by how much you rely on him. His strength is made perfect in your weakness. But weakness has to be admitted before it can be exchanged. Surrender is saying, Lord, I'm tired of doing this in my own strength. I'm done trying to figure it all out. I'm placing it in your hand. And when you do that, when you truly let go, that's when peace comes. That's when clarity comes. That's when God begins to align things in ways you never could have orchestrated. Surrender doesn't diminish you, it positions you. It puts you right where God can release his best, not your second best. It's the gateway to the miraculous. When God moves, he often moves in response to persistence. Not talent, not timing, not connections. That unshakable, immovable refusal to give up, even when nothing around you seems to be changing. Persistence is what keeps you praying when the heavens are silent. It's what keeps you walking when the road is long and the promise feels far away. It's what keeps you believing when your circumstances are shouting at you to quit. And let me tell you, persistence positions you for the miraculous because it proves that you trust God more than you trust what you see. Too many of us stop too soon. We give up at the 6th lap when God intended for us to see the breakthrough on the 7th. We grow tired because the process is longer than we expected. But God is not on your clock. He's not working according to your calendar. He's working according to his divine plan, and persistence is the bridge between the pain and the promise. You may not be able to control when God moves, but you can control whether you're still in position when he does. But look at the walls of Jericho. God told Joshua that he had already given the city into their hands. But then he gave them a strange command. March around the walls once a day for 6 days, and on the 7th day, march around 7 times. That didn't make any sense in the natural. No swords, no siege, it's a silent march. But they obeyed, they persisted. Day after day, even though nothing was changing, they kept walking. No cracks in the wall. No rumbling beneath their feet. Just obedience and persistence. And then came the 7th day, the 7th lap, and that's when the walls fell. What would have happened if they stopped on day 5? Or if they got tired on lap 6 and sat down? The miracle was tied to their consistency. God was testing their willingness to walk in obedience without evidence. And that's what persistence is. It's obedience without visible results. It's saying, God, even though I don't see it yet, I believe you're working. I believe you're faithful. So I'm going to keep walking. There's a reason the Bible tells us to ask, seek, and knock, not once, but continually. Jesus said in Luke 18 that we should always pray and never give up. And then he told the story of a persistent widow who kept coming to an unjust judge pleading for justice. She had no influence, no power, no leverage. But she had persistence. She kept showing up. And eventually the judge said, I don't fear God or care what people think, but because this widow keeps bothering me, I'll give her justice. Now, Jesus wasn't comparing God to an unjust judge. He was making a contrast. If an unrighteous judge will respond to persistence, how much more will your righteous, loving, faithful Father respond to his children who keep pressing in? Persistence is not about begging, it's about demonstrating faith. It's about showing God that you're serious, that you're not in this for convenience, you're in it for commitment. Sometimes God delays the breakthrough not to punish you, but to prepare you. Persistence stretches your faith. It grows your character. It strengthens your spirit. It builds a history with God, because every time you choose to stand when it would be easier to quit, you're building spiritual muscle. Every time you choose to praise when it would be easier to complain, you're preparing yourself to carry the weight of what God is bringing. Look at the woman with the issue of blood. For 12 years, she suffered. 12 years of doctors, 12 years of pain, 12 years of being considered unclean and pushed to the margins. But she didn't let those years define her faith. One day she heard that Jesus was passing through, and she said to herself, if I can just touch the hem of his garment, I'll be healed. That was faith, but it was also persistence. She had to push through the crowd. She had to fight through the whispers, the stares, the fear of being rejected, but she kept pressing. She refused to let her past pain keep her from present healing. And when she touched Jesus, power left his body. He stopped and said, who touched me? The disciples were confused. There was a whole crowd pressing in, but Jesus knew this touch was different. It was a touch of desperation, touch of persistence, a touch that pulled the miraculous from heaven. Some of us are one touch away, one prayer away, one act of obedience away from breakthrough. But we stop just short. We let discouragement speak louder than our faith. But God is saying today, don't stop pressing. Don't stop knocking. Don't stop walking. Because I see your persistence and I will respond. Persistence doesn't mean there won't be moments of doubt. It doesn't mean you won't feel tired or discouraged. But it does mean you don't quit. You keep showing up. You keep praying over that child. You keep believing for that healing. You keep standing on that promise, even if you have to do it with tears in your eyes and weakness in your bones. You keep going. Because faith is not just about the mountaintop. It's about the perseverance in the valley. God honors those who won't let go. Jacob wrestled with the angel all night and said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. That's the kind of grit God responds to. The kind that says, I'm not walking away without my miracle. Jacob walked away with a limp, but he also walked away with a blessing. So if you're tired, if you're weary, if you feel like nothing is moving, this is not the time to quit. This is the time to dig deeper, to plant your feet, to set your face like flint, because your persistence is preparing the ground for God's power. Keep pressing, keep praying, keep praising, because at the appointed time, he will. Family, I want you to imagine this scene. A man, wild, broken, and tormented, living among the tombs. Chains couldn't hold him. People had given up on him. But one day, Jesus steps on the shore, and suddenly all of hell starts trembling. And then something strange happens. The demons inside that man beg Jesus, send us into the pigs. The moment Jesus stepped out of the boat onto that shore in the region of the Gerasenes, something shifted in the spiritual atmosphere. The man who had been living among the tombs, screaming at night, cutting himself, terrifying everyone, ran to meet him. But make no mistake, it wasn't the man who truly recognized Jesus first. It was the demons inside him. They saw him coming and knew their time was over. Before Jesus even spoke a word, they were already panicking, already strategizing, already trembling. This is something you need to understand about the kingdom of darkness. It does not ignore Jesus. The devil doesn't treat him like an option. The demons don't argue about whether he exists. They know exactly who he is. James 2:19 says, even the demons believe and tremble. Tremble. They don't just believe he is real. They shake with fear because they know he carries absolute authority over them. The man's life had been in bondage for years. Chains couldn't hold him. People had tried to control him with human solutions, restraints, isolation, avoidance. But nothing worked. Why? Because you cannot solve a spiritual problem with physical tools. The world tries to counsel what only Christ can cleanse. And the devil loves it when people keep trying everything but Jesus. Because as long as they do that, the bondage remains. But that day was different. Jesus stepped onto that ground, and the atmosphere changed. His presence was like light breaking into a cave. Darkness doesn't negotiate with light. It flees. It cannot stay where light is burning brightly. That's why the demons immediately reacted. They couldn't hide anymore. They couldn't keep controlling that man like before. They couldn't whisper in his mind without being exposed. Notice something. Jesus didn't have to wrestle them. He didn't need to shout to prove his power. He didn't have to repeat a ritual. His very presence carried authority. The demons approached him and cried out, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? Swear to God that you won't torture me." Think about that. The demons were the ones who were afraid of being tortured, even though they had been torturing this man for so long. The roles reversed instantly, because in the presence of Jesus, the oppressor becomes the one who is oppressed. This should encourage you because if you belong to Jesus, his Spirit lives in you. That means you carry his presence into every situation. You might walk into a room and not say a word, but the spiritual realm will notice. The enemy knows when you are filled with the Spirit, and he knows he can't operate in the same freedom he once had. He will either flee or try to intimidate you, but never forget, his intimidation is proof of his fear. Some of you have been under attack, and you've thought, why does the enemy seem so aggressive right now? It's because he knows who's with you. He senses the presence of the Lord in your life and knows that his time is short. Attacks often intensify right before deliverance. The enemy fights hardest when he's losing control. This is why you cannot afford to walk without the presence of God. You can have money, education, influence, but none of that makes demons tremble. It's the anointing that breaks the yoke. It's the authority of Christ that causes the enemy to beg for mercy. The man in the tombs had endured years of torment, but all it took was one moment in the presence of Jesus to turn the tables. When you carry his presence, You don't have to fear darkness. Darkness fears you because it fears the one who lives in you. If you want, I can now expand key point 2 in the same style, so the whole sermon builds up with equal depth. That will make the video more engaging and powerful from start to finish. In Jewish culture, pigs were considered unclean animals. They weren't just dirty in the physical sense. They were ceremonially unclean, meaning God's people were forbidden to eat them or use them in sacrificial worship. They symbolized impurity, the kind of thing that couldn't be brought into the holy presence of God. So when the demons begged Jesus to let them enter the herd of pigs, they weren't making a random choice. They were revealing something about their nature. They are drawn to what is already unclean. Demons thrive in environments where sin, corruption, and moral filth are present. They seek out what is spiritually unfit for God's presence, because that is where they have the most freedom to operate. A holy vessel resists them, but an unclean vessel gives them room. The pigs represented a fitting host for them, not because the pigs had sinned, but because in the spiritual symbolism of that culture, pigs were the picture of something outside of God's sanctified order. And the truth is, the enemy still operates the same way today. If he can't live in a person who has been set free, he will look for another place that's available. A heart full of unforgiveness, a life clouded with compromise, a mind entertained by darkness. That's why the Bible says in Ephesians 4:27, do not give the devil a foothold. A foothold is a place in your life that gives him permission to stay. The unclean is an open door for the demonic. It might be bitterness you've been holding on to for years. It might be jealousy that you've been feeding quietly in your heart. It might be a habit you excuse because it's not hurting anyone, but spiritually, it's an invitation. Just like the pigs were naturally suited for what was unclean, there are parts of our lives that, if left unwashed by God's word, become natural landing places for the enemy. The pigs remind us that demons cannot inhabit holiness. They cannot dwell in what has been set apart for God. That's why when you walk in purity, you frustrate the plans of the enemy. He has nowhere to attach himself. He might try to circle around, but he will find no place to settle. Purity is not just about morality. It's about spiritual protection. That's also why Jesus, when he prayed for his disciples in John 17, asked the Father to sanctify them by the truth. Sanctification, being set apart for God, is the very thing that keeps you from becoming a host for darkness. The more you allow the Spirit of God to cleanse your heart, the less room there is for anything unholy to remain. The demons knew they could not stay in that man any longer. The presence of Jesus had driven them out. But notice, they didn't ask to be sent into the sea or into the air. They wanted the pigs. Why? Because the nature of darkness is to cling to what is defiled. They will avoid the light and run toward the shadows. They will resist purity and rush toward impurity. They prefer the familiar territory of the unclean, because in the unclean, they can still carry out their destruction. If you want to shut the door to the enemy, you have to make sure there's no pig pen left in your heart, no corner of compromise, no hidden filth, no secret place where sin is allowed to stay. This isn't about perfection, it's about surrender. Every area you surrender to God becomes off limits to the enemy. But every area you withhold becomes a potential home for something that wants to destroy you. This is why the demons didn't fight for a clean place. They fought for the pigs, because purity is their eviction notice, but uncleanness is their invitation. If you want, I can now expand key point 3. The same way, so this sermon flows seamlessly and builds intensity. That would keep the audience hooked for the full video runtime. Demons are restless, without a place to inhabit. Jesus himself told us in Matthew 12, 43, 45, when an impure spirit comes out of a person, it goes through arid places seeking rest and does not find it. Then it says, I will return to the house I left. That tells us something critical. Evil spirits are not content to wander aimlessly. They are always looking for a host, a place where they can influence, torment, and destroy. They are spiritual squatters who will occupy any territory they are given. That's why in the story of the man possessed in the Gerasenes, the demons didn't simply leave quietly when Jesus commanded them out. They pleaded for another home. They knew they could not remain in the man because the authority of Jesus was forcing them out, but they were desperate to remain in the physical realm, connected to something alive. It wasn't about the pigs themselves. It was about finding something to latch onto so they could continue their destructive work. You see, the devil is not satisfied with being absent. If he is cast out of one life, he will immediately search for another. If he loses control in one area, he will try to gain control in another. He doesn't just want to disrupt you. He wants to inhabit something that gives him influence. This is why the Bible warns us in 1 Peter 5:8 to be sober, minded, be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. A lion doesn't wander without purpose. It is actively looking for prey, for vulnerability, for an open door. That is exactly why the demons in this passage begged Jesus to send them into the pigs. They were about to lose their human host, and they didn't want to be left without a base of operations. The pigs were not their first choice. People are always the enemy's primary target because people carry the image of God. But if he cannot remain in a person, he will settle for anything that keeps him present in the environment. And don't miss this. The fact that they begged for pigs means that being homeless in the spirit realm is torment for them. They crave embodiment. Without it, their ability to act is limited. This also explains why demonic influence in people is so dangerous. Because when the enemy finds a host, he can operate through their thoughts, words, and actions, bringing chaos far beyond what he could do as a wandering spirit. This is why spiritual warfare is not a game. When you drive the enemy out of one area of your life, you must fill that space with the Spirit of God. If you leave it empty, you're inviting the enemy to return. And often, as Jesus warned, he will come back with reinforcements stronger than before. The goal is not just eviction. The goal is replacement. You have to replace what left with something greater. The power, presence, and truth of God. When Jesus allowed the demons to enter the pigs, it was a demonstration that the enemy has no independent authority. They cannot move without his permission. But it was also a picture of their nature. They will cling to anything rather than be without a host. They are like parasites. Their survival depends on attaching themselves to something living, something they can manipulate toward destruction. And here's the sobering part: the pigs didn't survive the encounter. The moment the demons entered them, they ran violently down the steep bank and drowned in the water. That's what the enemy does with anything he possesses. Whether it's a person, a family, a community, or even an opportunity. His end goal is always destruction. He cannot build, he can only corrupt. He cannot bless, he can only curse. That's why Jesus said in John 10:10, the thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. The demon's request for pigs shows us something about their desperation, their dependence on a host, and their destructive nature. Wherever they settle, destruction follows. That's why you can't give them any place in your life, not even a foothold, because they will take a foothold and turn it into a fortress. If you want, I can now expand key point 4 in the same style, which will take this sermon into the moment of Jesus' absolute authority. A very powerful climax for your video. That's where your audience will really feel the breakthrough moment. When the demons begged to be sent into the pigs, they were not speaking as free agents. They were acknowledging a truth. They could not escape. Nothing moves without the permission of Jesus. They didn't run past him. They didn't force their way into the pigs on their own. They asked. That request alone is proof that their power is limited and their authority is borrowed. They can only operate within the boundaries God allows. This is a reality many believers forget in the middle of spiritual warfare. We see the enemy moving. We feel the pressure. And we start to think he's running wild. But the book of Job shows us clearly, even Satan must report to God, and even his attacks are subject to divine limits. In Job 1:12, God told the enemy, very well, then everything he has is in your power, but on the man himself do not lay a finger. That wasn't a suggestion. That was a line the devil could not cross. And the same is true today. The enemy's reach is restricted by the authority of heaven. That's why the demons in Mark 5 had to beg. They knew they couldn't make the next move without approval. They were dangerous, yes, but they were not in control. Jesus stood as the ultimate gatekeeper. And nothing, not even the forces of hell, could bypass him. This is the security of the believer, that every battle, every storm, and every attack passes through the filter of God's sovereign will before it reaches you. This truth should bring you peace in the middle of your struggle. Because if God allowed it, he has already prepared grace to carry you through it. If he said yes to a season of testing, it's not because he wants to destroy you. It's because he wants to develop you. The enemy will never have the final say. What he intends for harm, God will turn for good. The cross itself is the ultimate example. Hell thought it had won when Jesus was crucified. But that very act was the doorway to salvation for the world. And don't overlook this. When the demons asked, Jesus gave permission. That means he was not reacting in panic. He was in complete control of the situation. He could have sent them straight to the abyss. But instead, he allowed them to enter the pigs, knowing full well that their nature would lead them to destruction. The same authority that cast them out also determined where they could and could not go. This is the authority of the one you serve. The storms obey him. The sicknesses bow to him. The enemy trembles before him. Colossians 2:15 says, having disarmed the powers and authorities, he made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them by the cross. Disarmed means they no longer have the weapons they once wielded. Triumph means he has already won the battle before you even step onto the field. When you understand this, you stop living in fear of what the enemy can do. You begin to rest in the confidence that God is not only aware of your battle, he is in command of it. The enemy's actions are not random. They are permitted within divine boundaries. If the Lord has not given the word, the enemy cannot take the step. So even when you feel surrounded, remember this: the authority of Jesus is not limited by the size of your storm. The same voice that told the wind and the waves to be still is the voice that told those demons when to go and where to go. And that same voice is speaking over your life, setting limits on what the enemy can do, and ensuring that every trial that reaches, you will serve a greater purpose than the pain it causes. If you want, I can now expand key point 5 in the same style, which will bring the sermon into the victorious testimony moment. Perfect for an uplifting closing in your video. That's where the emotional and spiritual high point will land. The moment the demons entered the pigs, the entire herd, about 2,000 of them, rushed down a steep bank and drowned in the lake. What happened next is just as important as the deliverance itself. News spread quickly. The herdsmen ran into the town, telling everyone what they had seen. And soon the people came out to witness the scene for themselves. They had known this man as the terror of the tombs, the one who broke chains, the one who cried out night and day, the one no one could tame. Yet here he was, sitting calmly, fully clothed, and in his right mind. The transformation was undeniable. This is the pattern of God's deliverance. He doesn't just set you free privately. He turns your freedom into a public testimony. The same people who saw you in bondage will see you in victory. The same community that once wrote you off will have to acknowledge the change. God loves to turn the enemy's destruction into a stage for his glory. Think about it. The enemy's plan was to destroy that man's life completely, to isolate him until he died among the tombs. But the very moment of his deliverance became the beginning of his ministry. After this encounter, Jesus told him, "Go home to your own people and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you." And the Bible says he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him. A man who once spread fear was now spreading hope. That's how God works. He doesn't just silence the enemy. He uses the enemy's attack as the raw material for your testimony. What was meant to bury you becomes the platform where you stand and declare the goodness of God. This is why Revelation 12:11 says, "They overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony." The blood breaks the chains, but the testimony tells the world that the chains are gone. The drowning of the pigs also served a greater purpose. It made the deliverance visible. The spiritual realm is invisible to most people, but God gave the townspeople a physical picture of what had happened. They saw the cost of the man's freedom. Those pigs represented the grip the enemy had on that man's life. And when they perished, it was as if the chains had been thrown into the sea forever. The destruction of the pigs was also a reminder that anything the enemy inhabits will ultimately be destroyed. This was a warning to the onlookers. Don't give him a place in your life, because his end game is always death. It's interesting that while the man was now free, the townspeople reacted with fear and asked Jesus to leave their region. Sometimes people are more comfortable with your bondage than your freedom because your transformation disrupts their normal. But even in their rejection, God's plan moved forward. Jesus left the man there as a living testimony, a constant reminder of God's power in their midst. The man didn't need a pulpit, a church building, or a title. His life was the sermon. Every time someone saw him, they saw proof that the kingdom of God had invaded their region. Every word he spoke about the mercy he received carried the weight of lived experience. People might debate theology, but they cannot deny transformation. This is why the enemy fights so hard to keep you bound. Because he knows that once you are free, your story will be unstoppable. Your testimony will spread in places you never imagined. Your very existence will remind others that no one is too far gone, no chain is too strong, and no darkness is too deep for the light of God to break through. If you'd like, I can now put all 5 expanded points together into one complete, polished sermon script so it's ready for recording and editing for your YouTube channel. That way, it flows naturally from start to finish. The man who had been tormented for so long didn't walk away from that encounter the same. In one moment, the power of Jesus not only silenced the demons, but restored everything the enemy had tried to destroy. His mind was healed. His dignity was restored. His purpose was awakened. He came to Jesus in chains, but left as a messenger of freedom. That's what happens when the Son of God steps into your situation. You can't remain the same. And that same power is available to you right now. No matter how long you've been struggling, no matter how deep the darkness has felt, no matter how hopeless the situation has appeared, there is no chain strong enough to keep Jesus out. There is no voice loud enough to drown out his authority. There is no pit so deep that his hand can't reach you. The demons begged. The pigs drowned. The man was restored. And the entire region was left talking about the power they had witnessed. This is what God still does. He takes what the enemy meant for evil and turns it into a story that brings him glory. He takes broken people and makes them living testimonies. He takes battles that seemed impossible and uses them as proof of his unmatched authority. Maybe right now you feel surrounded by battles you didn't ask for. Maybe the enemy has been whispering that it will always be this way, that the chains will never come off. But the same Jesus who stepped onto that shore is stepping into your life. His presence still makes demons tremble. His word still sets captives free. His mercy still restores what was lost. Don't let the enemy convince you that your story is over. The very thing that has been your greatest pain can become your greatest platform for God's glory. When you are delivered, it won't just affect you. It will impact everyone around you. People will see what God has done, and they will know it was his hand, not yours. So hold on, stand firm. Stay surrendered. Because when Jesus moves, the enemy must beg for permission. The chains must break, and your life will never be the same again.